Welcome to today's webinar. Today we're going to be speaking about AI and the algorithmic management of work and the implications for work time in Europe. We have two amazing speakers. We have Dr. Agnieszka Piasna, which is a senior researcher in the Economic, Employment and Social Policies units at ETUI. And we have Dr. James Muldoon, who is a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Exeter and head of digital research at the Autonomy think tank. I think we've said that, Agnieszka, you're starting? Yeah?
I can go first.
So what we're going to ask is that you talk for maybe 15 minutes or so, and then we'll go straight into James' presentation afterwards, and we'll keep questions to the end. We have some minutes to play with here or there, but I'll give you a 2-minute warning when we are reaching the end of your sort of time slot, if that's okay.
Yes. I hope I will see the warnings. That's always the problem with this.
I'll just unmute myself and tell you. Okay. Perfect.
So
thank you.
I'll try with the slides. Yeah, I hope you can see the screen. Right, so well, thank you very much for the invitation to present here, and thanks for coming virtually to listen to the talk. What I would like to share with you, I don't know how to change those slides now. What I would like to share today are some of the thoughts about the impact of algorithmic management, and which uses AI in most cases, relies on some sort of automated process of decision making on working time. So just to set some definitions or concepts straight, what I mean by algorithmic management is the use of diverse set of technological tools, techniques to automate what managers do in companies. So that can include task allocation, monitoring, evaluation of workers. That can also include scheduling, disciplining of workers, firing and hiring decisions. And the impact of algorithmic management on the power balance between workers and managers, or employers and workers, some ethical issues involved, that has been discussed at length in the literature. But one area that is, I would argue, profoundly impacted by automated management is also the temporal structure of work. And here there's much less research or conceptual work done so far. So my main argument that I would like to convince you to or present to you is that on one hand, AI-enabled oversight and control over workers, so algorithmic management, optimizes efficiency. And this optimization is this classical lowering of labor costs with the constant output. So the classic requirement for implementing working time reduction. So we should expect that working time reduction would follow implementation of algorithmic management and the cost-saving outcomes of it. But there is also the parallel countervailing tendency of algorithmic management blurring and expanding time demands that are put on workers. And that negates any possibility for achieving worker-led working time reduction. So there is this paradox of working time at one point from one side shortening, and on the other hand, time demands expanding. So this is much more details are put into are presented in the article that I published earlier this year. You have the title on the slide. It's Algorithm of Time: How Algorithmic Management Changes the Temporalities of Work and Prospects for Working Time Reduction. So I'll try to just briefly sketch some of the main points. And looking for comparative data, which is not easy, I'll try to illustrate the points with data for EU countries collected by Eurofund. Yeah, how do I jump to the next one? Right. Let's first just take a broader look at the history of transformations in the way working time is organized, or the logic of working time. When we, I'll try to minimize I actually don't see my own slides, sorry. I see the Zoom frames. Okay. So looking at the key features of different ways of organizing working time, in the pre-industrial societies, it was, we can call it a task-oriented approach to time. So it was the completion of a task that defines how much time is needed to perform it. Workers had much more discretion in allocating time to different tasks, insofar as the task was demanded to be attended, such as feeding the animals or performing some task in the farm. Otherwise, they would be lost, negatively affecting the worker. There was also much less of a division between what is the labor or paid work and leisure or private time, private sphere of workers, but they had much more control over the performance of tasks. Now, when in the industrial system, the logic of time must have changed because of the need to synchronize work of many workers. Then the clock time prevailed. So work was organized by the clock, timed in continuous blocks, and purchased in those blocks from workers. It was the employers then, the management task to synchronize and control the work process so that as much activity is performed in the block of time, this continuous block of time that is bought from workers. So that really changed the meaning of work. It was the premise that you have to go somewhere else to perform the paid activity that also raised the boundary, more symbolic boundary, because the place of work differed from the place of living, that paid and unpaid activities were much clearly separated. And then moving to the more tertiary time, so to the service economy, and at the same time, the regulation of labor markets, we can call this phase the fragmentation of working time. So what employers strive to achieve is purchase working time, not in this continuous block, where it was on the employers to put as many activities in this time, so like the scientific management type of optimization, but purchase only those times that match the demands on workers, demands in terms of labor supply. And any inefficiency, we can think of the platform economy as all the zero-hour contracts as the main manifestation of that, or the clearest example, where any inefficiency or cost of that are shifted onto workers. Now, algorithmically managed work comes sort of at the next stage, but it builds or takes elements of the previous of those previous regimes. And the main argument here is that it changes the logic of organizing and structuring working time. So on the one hand, as I said, it increases efficiency, what I call atomized and punctuated time, where paid work is offered in increasingly shorter and scattered time units. And at the same time, this incessant availability, which is the countervailing tendency, that the commitment of work-related time on the side of workers is expanding and lengthening. So you can think of the outcomes as sort of the balance, where one leads towards shortening of hours, the other lengthening, and the outcome very much depends on the balance of power between workers and managers or employers. Now, looking into more depth into atomized and punctuated time. So we can think of this as this implementation of just-in-time logic or work practices when on-demand and highly scalable workforces are hired or employed or engaged only for the performance of tasks when they arise and when the need to perform the task is there, not during other times. So the working time can be extremely fragmented. It's not just the zero-hour contract that foresaw several hours as a continuous shift. So the working time can now be managed in much smaller units because of just computational capacity of algorithm. It wouldn't be feasible for a human manager to manage such finely defined moments. So work activities are decomposed into small time intervals. It's not no longer even a task that defines work. It can be a timing of a task. So in services, it's quite, in many of the service sector jobs, it's difficult to define a task. So the unit of time, such as 15 minutes or 1 minute or even 10 seconds slot, can be then used to define a paid task and attach payment only to this tiny moment. Of course, there are various techniques that allow squeezing time allocated for each task, so that increases efficiency and therefore was dubbed the digital Taylorism. Also, and the third, so to say, development is limiting the minimum time that is paid. So everything that falls in between those finely defined tasks, such as waiting or time for recuperation, social interaction at work, labor reproduction, all that can be put outside of the bracket of paid working time. And of course, the best illustration for all those practices is the platform economy or Amazon warehouses. And here you can see the chat from, or like the message boards of Amazon warehouse workers when they give each other advice on how to kind of survive. So yeah, I think that's the best word, survive that work environment. And they refer to tasks as in a few seconds, defined by few seconds. So like shave off a few seconds from the takt time, to improve your efficiency, try to bring your time to a couple of seconds. You see this screenshot of the display board at the workplace where tasks are defined as below 1 second, here almost 12-second units. So the fragmentation of time is brought to the extreme. Now, can we observe that also among the wider workforce? That was my attempt to actually try to find those or map those developments, not just in isolated workplaces such as Amazon or platform economy, but more broadly. So in context, this is the survey that asked every person in paid employment in the EU countries about their work, and those who said that the computerized systems influence what they do at work. So obviously that does not need to be algorithmic management, but some form of automated management of work. And I compared this influence of computer to work at short notice. You can see this is the left-hand side graph. There is increase. So people who are not influenced, it doesn't apply to them or are not influenced at all, they report less work at short notice, which would be one of those intensity measures, whereas those with the increasing influence of computers, that incidence of short notice work also increases. Another measure is just work intensity, so working at high speed and to tight deadlines. And here also you can see a linear increase along the increasing influence of computerized systems. So again, not perfect measure, but here's the whole population of EU workers, of the working age and employed in the EU. So these trends are actually observable across workforces. So now we should achieve working time reduction with those optimization techniques. We don't, because of the various techniques and barriers that are kind of resurrected together with the fragmentation and atomization of time to actually ensure that the whole process works. Because for that to work, there needs to be reliability of workers who are there to pick up those scatters and atomized units of paid activity. Otherwise, if they only are there for very short periods of time and not cover longer periods, then there is no one to actually pick up the activity and employers cannot rely on work tasks being performed. So what are the main so to say processes that ensure this incessant availability, how I call it, and at the same time there are major barriers to realizing working time reduction. So first one is individualization of the employment relationship and working time. And this streams various aspects in the platform economy that would be using self-employment or independent contracting, but also for instance, giving premium to availability in hiring decisions. When the algorithm allocates tasks to workers, it can compute the availability declared by workers as a premium in allocating work. It's not only in the platform economy that happens, also in normal retail jobs, it is used in the scheduling software. Also over hiring in so to say quotation marks, because sometimes there is no employment relationship, but just more workers are allowed to declare their availability than there would be tasks. So there is this competition between workers and the self-exploitation imposed by the autonomy paradox of self-directed workers who actually make themselves more available to secure some employment. Then extraction of work-related activities as unpaid labor. Many of the tasks are automated, but such as managerial roles. So many of the tasks that managers would do before are now automated, but this is just notional automation because the worker then him or herself then needs to operate the software, needs to declare availability, needs to put some labor, some time into ensuring the schedule can work for the person. Waiting times in between. Yeah.
Sorry, that's 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that should be enough. So many of the tasks shift as unpaid labor to the worker, but also what's interesting, they're also extracted to the wider society. So think of all the serve services, sorry, and or client feedback, for instance. So this is the labor actually extracted from clients, from the society, which creates economic value for companies, but it's not counted as paid labor. And the third element is the blurring of the work non-work boundary, which we could observe in the pre-industrial time regime. And now again, it's introduced mainly through technology, such as using a single device, a handheld a mobile phone, for instance, that the worker carries around. So it's used for both private and work purposes. Work location for remote workers, that is the same private home as the workplace, and at the same time it's a home. So we have the citations collected from remote platform workers saying that they just feel guilty when they are at home, and potentially they could have the screen on that filters the tasks and they don't do it. So you feel guilty by not being on 24/7. And then various gamification techniques, which again, Amazon is just the best source of all those examples. Here you can see the race against yourself in space race, for instance, game. So just the technology allows to gather so much data about workers, and then they can race against themselves, so that beat their past performance, be faster, be more available, and outperform themselves. So this is just one example because it's easy to get, but this gamification is also used, for instance, in training surgeons, because by the speeding against yourself, they are more motivated perhaps to spend more time on those activities. Again, looking at the same data set, so the computerized system influences how people, what they do at work, and work in your free time to meet work demands. You can see that again, that increases. We see this increase of the availability that spills over into the private time, and work-life balance goes down with the higher influence of computer system. So just the final word of conclusion. So what can we do then? How to achieve working time reduction? How to start thinking of this in this framing of working time? And in the time-centered model, in the industrial society, factory workers at some point, they accepted the new categories of time. They didn't fight against them at some point. At first they did, but then started fighting within them. So about shortening of working time without challenging the structure of the continuous blocks of time that the labor was paid in. In the contemporary, in fragmented time, that's already shifted a bit, and predictability, or certainly related to calling off shifts, for instance, that was the issue, and granularity of working time. Now in algorithmic managed time, these are new issues that also emerge, such as safeguarding the barriers between work and life, ensuring individual control over time, limiting granularity, which now was brought to the extreme, including all work-related activities in paid work time. So that's a huge trend that actually expands time that workers need to dedicate to paid activities, but are not compensated, and so on and so on. So we just need to rethink the way we approach perhaps working time reduction, and rephrase the demands from this time-centered model that many of the demands are rooted in, or proposals, perhaps not demands, and then think of the traps that the algorithmic management also brings to the table. Right, thank you very much, and apologies for expanding on time.
No, thank you so much. That was super interesting. It really reminds me of one of the episodes. So it's a Black Mirror, what's it called? It's one of those where you thought that would be, you know, the dystopian would never end up, but actually it's very similar to one of those episodes. Thank you so much. We'll go straight into our second presentation. If you guys have any questions that you want to write already now in the chat, please feel free. Otherwise, we are leaving time at the end of the presentation. All right, I'll hand over to you, James. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Can you see my presentation, and also can you not see all these people that are messaging me, because both are very keen?
I can see the presentation, but it's not in full screen. We see the
Not
whole
full
sort of.
I want full screen.
Um,
Let me just reduce this. Okay, is that better?
yeah, that's better. Thank you so much.
Okay. Today I'll be talking about the way in which AI systems are not acting on workers, but in fact how AI systems are produced. So I want to explore essentially the working conditions and the working time arrangements that many workers in the global south who work on these AI products actually experience. So it's kind of like the other end of the stick than what we were just talking about. So very briefly, I just want to show you this diagram to kind of give a sense of the supply chain that is needed for an AI product to get produced. So anytime we have any kind of like machine learning algorithm, obviously you need a lot of inputs to produce that. You need things like water and electricity. You need the raw materials to create the physical infrastructure. And you also need a lot of human labor. So the results that I'm presenting today are from a field work that was done in Kenya and Uganda this year. And we were looking at what's called an AI data annotation company. So for machine learning models to read data and to make sense of it, this data has to be correctly annotated. And this might involve boxes around certain items in pictures. It might involve training a language model, all kinds of things that might be needed. So we're actually having a look at what that process is like, what the working conditions are like, and yeah, how these outputs get made. So let me just skip through because this is actually from another lecture I gave. So here's what I call the AI data pipeline. So for a company, in order to produce these kinds of models and the AI products that get sold on to vendors, what we need is a few steps along the stage. So we need data to be collected in some way. This might be bought from a public domain data set. It might be individually collected by the company. It might be a combination of different things. And then these data sets are kind of curated, so they make decisions about which aspects of it they want to keep in, how the data set is going to be built and constructed. And then this very long and arduous process of the data getting annotated. Now, the estimates are that 80% of working time on machine learning algorithms is not the kind of work that engineers might do in these AI labs like OpenAI, but rather this very menial and time-consuming and often low-paid and poorly remunerated data annotation work. So this is where the bulk of the actual human labor gets taken up. So, you know, this is a couple of examples of the kind of things they might do. They might be putting these bounding boxes around people for self-driving software, or they might be doing something a bit more sophisticated, such as this, what's called LiDAR, which is kind of like light or image detection, something or other, where, you know, there are sensors on cars and they kind of bounce lasers to judge the distance and velocity of certain things, and you create these 3D maps. So here is where we did our research. It was at a data annotation company with 3 centers across Kenya and Uganda. And, you know, just to give you a general vibe of what these places are like, it's kind of like a digital sweatshop or a kind of call center, but, you know, often outsourced to the global south. So you have these kind of long rows of people that are working in these kind of hierarchically organized office situations. There are kind of team leaders that patrol about 30 people to make sure people are working. And the centers themselves contain anywhere from like 1,000 or 2,000 people. So what was actually going on here? So we were invited by the company's leadership team to conduct analysis of the operations. They kind of accompany, I just haven't named them here because, you know, we're still worried about getting sued and things. So that's all just getting worked out, basically. But, you know, they've got their headquarters in San Francisco and several outsourcing centers in these locations in Kenya and Uganda. So we kind of had a look at the production floors. We talked to people, we listened to presentations from management, and we interviewed 46 workers for like 45 to 90 minutes on themes about what their work involves, what they do, what the management structure is like, etc. So one of the things we found as part of the Fair Work Foundation, so this is an organization, one of the organizations I work with, this one is at the University of Oxford at the Internet Institute. I'm going to just skip over that. So the first thing to note here about the working time and working time reduction related to these workers is they're all on temporary contracts. So the way in which the whole structure of the organization is set up is that there are permanent contracts given to the US senior leadership team. So this is like corporate office in San Francisco and Montreal, I think. And then there's also permanent contracts given to the very senior leadership of the East African centers. So people who are like the kind of corporate people that will liaise directly with the US team. And so there might be like 5 or 10 or 20 of these people, and they're like the very senior people, often drawn from the tech sector or banking sector in these East African countries, or other BPO. So BPO is called a business process outsourcing center. And it's, was kind of pioneered in India in the 1990s, where corporations would outsource a lot of their back end and call center work to countries in the global south. So yeah, this is a kind of form of BPO work. It's like a big center where big work processes get outsourced to. And then the entire staff that are actually doing the data annotation. So this is the majority of workers who are working on AI are working on temporary contracts. So they're on like 1, 2, or 3 month long contracts. And they're working very long hours. The kind of maximum working week, at least in Kenya, I think was 48 hours, so a bit longer than here. But a lot of these workers are getting in, I mean, the way they calculate it is very sus, right? So the workers get in at 8 o'clock, but of course, you have to arrive at 7:30, and you do a 10-hour shift, and you've got a half-hour lunch break in that, and that's basically it. You have a few tiny toilet breaks, but you're working 8 a.m. till 6 p.m. Monday to Friday. And I guess related to this kind of working time, to how this structure is set up, a lot of these workers have very strict targets, and if they don't meet their targets, they're going to be asked to come in and work longer. So let's just have a quick look at how that works. So one of the things here is that working time is managed as part of a broader regime of labor discipline. And the quality of these jobs is really connected to the fact that they do have them all on short-term contracts. That the way in which the workers are managed is through a constant fear of getting put on what's called the bench. And if you're on the bench, you're basically unemployed. You're kind of in the Rolodex or the phone book of the company as someone they might get in touch with if they ever want to rehire workers, right? But it's basically like allows them to have a kind of very dispensable and very malleable workforce that they can kind of put workers on and off the bench, in which they receive no pay if they're not hitting their targets. So workers are monitored based on 3 targets: the speed, the quality, and the efficiency of their work. And so for that 10-hour shift, every second of your day is monitored electronically from your computer screen, and how many annotation tasks you complete is recorded. And so you have big screens in these centers with your name, like a leaderboard, basically, of who's doing the most work, and people's names are either in green or they're in red. And if your name is in red, you're not meeting your targets. And the threat is basically that your contract will not be renewed at the end of the month or the end of when it's up. And so this management and surveillance of working time of these AI workers allows them to push an incredible rate of speed and efficiency on people, because there's always someone else that can take their job, right? And it's the kind of work that after about a week's training, most people could do it. So it doesn't require a high degree of education or of training, although the work is tough. I wouldn't call it low skill work per se, because you do need a degree of skill in order to complete it and meet the targets. And the way the targets are set is they do a trial run for about a couple of days, and they essentially draw a line at about the 80 or 90% aisle of workers, so that the bottom 10% of workers will, by the very nature of how the target is set, will not be meeting their targets. So it's kind of the whole system has a kind of built-in mechanism to eliminate constantly every month the bottom 10% of workers. And so all this is facilitated through this system where, you know, their work is constantly monitored, you know, from the moment they check in with their biometric pass to the moment they leave. Everything is kind of surveilled, and their working time is judged accordingly. Now, I mentioned before that, you know, the 5 10-hour days is not the end of their work. So if they finish a day and they haven't met their targets, you know, they could be encouraged to do unpaid overtime, in which they might spend an extra hour or two meeting the targets for the company. Because essentially, if you get to Friday and you haven't finished your work, a lot of workers are encouraged to come in to do a kind of 4-hour shift on Saturday to meet their targets for that week. So it involves this rapid turnover of workers, very minimal job security, and the way in which their working time is managed is essentially to squeeze as much work as possible out of them for the allotted wage. One of the problems with the salary and the remuneration structure at the firm is that, you know, the firm advertises itself as an ethical AI firm, right? That they're helping produce ethical AI, and they do so by paying their workers a living wage. And they use, you know, one of the prominent methodologies, which is called Anchor, and they kind of set a benchmark about what that wage is. Now, we saw when we were here that, you know, many of these workers were not actually getting paid the living wage. The way in which it was structured was actually, you know, if they meet certain incentives, then their standard wage could be raised above the living one. But actually, it wasn't really the case that all workers were being paid a living one. But there were some complexities here. One of them is that this sort of formal work was so much better than a lot of the other options that were available, particularly when it came to Uganda. You know, this is, you know, we were at a very, you know, relatively small town in the north of the country. The other options are basically, unless you're working at a bank, at an NGO, for the government, you know, you're essentially in the informal economy. And so, like the picture here, you might be selling fruit or veg at a market. You might be selling SIM cards or phone credit at something similar. You might be selling clothes. You might be selling juices on the side of the road. But all of this is very precarious work, right? In which you're not guaranteed a salary. It's going to be really hard to support your family. And the overall wage is going to be much less than you have in the formal economy. But at the same time, you know, many of these workers, while grateful that they had this opportunity, also were very adamant that it often wasn't enough to meet their basic needs.
2 minutes.
Great. So the wages were, not adequate for that. So I think, I'm just going to skip over that, unfortunately. So I think one of the, to kind of sum up here, one of the issues that's going on is that the way in which the structure of these companies is set up is done so entirely to kind of extract value from these vulnerable workers. So the company calls this impact sourcing because they're going out of their way, according to them, to hire workers who might not otherwise have opportunities to enter the formal job market. But who benefits from this arrangement is kind of what we want to ask when we do these interviews. The company gets access to a very highly disciplined workforce for obvious reasons. You know, they can go out and tell all their investors and corporate employees that they're, you know, a great social responsibility company. They have great ESG credentials, and it allows them to access certain sectors of the venture capital market who are interested in social impact companies and who will only invest money if you're doing a certain type of business model. But what we found when we got there, that the way in which this works in practice is actually highly exploitative of these workers, in which so much of the value that's being produced by them is sucked up to return to investors and to pay, extremely high salaries for the kind of corporate management of the company. So this is a kind of look not at how AI is disciplining workers or interacting with forms of working time, but really the working conditions of the AI supply chain itself. So who are the workers that are making all these AI products for us, and what kinds of working conditions and working time are they laboring under? So that's kind of, that's what we've shared today. So happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. And that is perfect on time. I always appreciate that. So thank you for two great presentations looking at AI and algorithmic management from two very different perspectives. I'll just start by seeing if people have any questions. Please feel free to either raise your hand, you can unmute yourself, or you can write them in the chat. Just following sort of the presentation, while giving people some time to ask questions. Agnieszka, I'm wondering if one of the last things that you were speaking about in your presentation was where do we go from here? Sort of, you were talking about some of the sort of impacts or the quite dystopian thing that we can see of algorithmic management. And you said that we can actually think strategically a bit about how to use this information in the way that we're creating the demands about work time going forward. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. To James, I think mine also is a little bit looking forward. What can we, knowing this information, and especially knowing that, like you say, these type of companies are probably, if you're looking for doing ethical investments, you would probably go for this and think, this is great, I'm doing a good deed. Is there anything, what can be done? Oh, my dog, I'm so sorry. Agnieszka, I hand over to you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think it's really important to realize what lies behind algorithmic management, because it is a black box, literally. We don't always know what the algorithm bases its decisions on, because it's automated, it learns from the data it receives, but it's many of the challenges or the ways it restructures working time perhaps are not fully realized, and they also differ across work contexts. So I think it's really useful to have those maybe simplified dystopian conceptualizations just to highlight certain things that might not surface as immediately obvious in what negotiations or regulation on working time might need to involve to actually be effective. So the granularity, this atomization of work time perhaps brings us more to looking at how narrow the minimum period of time, like chunk of time, can be, so that it still qualifies as paid working time. And I know that in Belgium there is some legislation, there are some legal limits on that. So I think you cannot buy working time in less than 3-hour blocks, if I'm not mistaken. So that's already going into towards this, right? Limiting the granularity, but perhaps there are other forms of achieving this granularity that we are just not fully aware of. So it is just useful to see what the technology perhaps brings new to the table, or even resurrects old to the table, and to what extent it just augments the practices that we've seen with 0-hour contracts or on-call work, or the debate about active or on-call time, which also there was the trend towards not considering as fully remunerated the time that is just made available for the employer, but it's just not spent on performing working tasks. So it's just good to keep in mind those debates and be aware of what might be the trade-offs once we achieve that working time is indeed shorter nominally, but then what happens with the unpaid time, what happens with the quality or predictability of hours and income.
Thank you very much. James.
I'm not sure I followed your question. The dog came in and it kind of,
Yes.
I lost the train. Was it just
So-
something about investing in these companies?
No, I was just interested in sort of I mean, this was very new to me, your presentation. I was very fascinated. And I'm definitely one of those people who was under the impression that maybe, you know, this is these types of firms that have the ESG ratings, and maybe it's actually not as great as we think it is. So where do we go from here? What is there any way that we as an organization, as individuals, as researchers, as people can help, or not help, you know, do you know what I mean?
I mean, not really, but I guess what can be done by other organizations is you can put pressure on these firms to live up to their standards by having workplaces or civil society organizations come in and do these kinds of ratings, because in the process of scoring this firm, they have made several changes to what they do in order to try to, you know, keep up with the kind of scorecard that they'll receive. And you see this a lot, kind of consumer pressure that, you know, you have civil society organizations that give people like A, B, C or whatever. It's very familiar to consumers in the kind of retail and clothing spaces. And maybe that's one option that could be pursued in the kind of tech space as well. But obviously that on its own is not enough, right? So more prominently, you would have the possibility of thinking about binding legislation. So Germany just passed a kind of supply chain act, which would force lead firms like Tesla or BMW to monitor the working conditions of workers within their supply chains. And so that could include places that are in East Africa or Philippines or India or elsewhere. There are a few problems with how that would work in practice, but that would be another option for what we might do in order to kind of improve working conditions for these workers who might not benefit from EU legislation in the same way that other workers that you're interested in do.
Thank you very much. So I have a question here in the chat for Agnieszka. So I'm going to read out the post. When I worked several years in a call center 15 years ago, the time of all tasks and phone calls were measured precisely like the picture you showed about Amazon workers. This is not new in itself. What does it mean? That AI changes the nature of management, that AI enlarge the workplaces where the measuring of tasks is possible? Do we already have concrete evidences about that?
Yes, thank you. Well, this is a good observation. What is new and what is really just adding steroids, so to say, to some of the practices already observed in the service sector and with the fragmentation and the regulation of employment. So I'm not sure what is the question. I mean, it's a very good observation. That is just expanding the scale of the practices used in places such as call centers. But what AI or algorithmic management enables is, first of all, to process much more data. So it can be brought up to the much larger scale. It can be applied to scattered workforces. You really don't need a human manager then to disciplines to somehow manage workers, to put the schedules together, to monitor the performance targets. It can be done automatically. As James showed us, it can be then matched against some arbitrary performance goals. It can also be applied to other sectors when it will be more difficult to just have a human with a pen and pencil going around workers and telling them when they should come to work, and also measuring the time that then spent on a task. So in terms of the evidence, I really like the study on the care sector. These are the home care workers who are given 15 minutes, or not given, their work is defined as 15 minutes visiting one client. So the measurement of the 15 minutes is done by technology. They log in, they log out once they come in and go out. It also monitors them, where they are, how they move, and it also allows to take out everything that they don't complete within 15 minutes out of their paycheck. So it's not remunerated time. If they need to stay longer for a valid reason, or they travel between clients, that is not their working time. So I think many of those things just wouldn't be possible without the technology that takes, first of all, crunches much more data and takes many of the decisions out of the human to the machine. So they're faster, much easier to be implemented. And then, of course, the balance of power changes, because it's more difficult to bargain with the automated decision, to go and question the decision, to ask for change of shifts, to say there was a valid reason why you couldn't meet your target. This is just all the, it's more automated. There is the position of workers changes vis-a-vis such processes. So I think there is more qualitative change than in inventing completely new new practices. If that was really, if I got the question right.
Nicola, is there anything you want to add?
No, it's okay. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you. Do we have any other questions to any of our speakers? India.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks both James and Agnieszka, really interesting presentations. I've got a question, one each for both of you. So Agnieszka, one question about whether there's been any evidence that you've seen in your research of kind of labour organisation or unionisation leading to a reversal in the sort of trend that you've made the argument for. So the trend between, you know, efficiency increasing but labour time actually increasing. So any case studies of that. And James, I suppose a bit of a question about regulation. And I know that you mentioned about was it Uganda that has kind of 48-hour maximum working week, but that the and that the outsourced companies can actually kind of, you know, may go around that by calling in employees to come back to do extra work if they haven't met their targets. So is regulation more effective if it's come from the global north that then impacts the companies that are then, you know, outsourcing to the global south, or is it more effective to come from the global south governments themselves?
Should I go first, or James, do you want? Yeah, so in terms of labor organizing, one issue is that this is a new topic for most of the national unions that we've talked to. We are now starting the project at ETY to actually collect the good practices or any practices of collective bargaining in the broad area of AI and algorithmic management. So I hope there will be much more good practices to share in time. For now, we can see what ETUC, for instance, so the European Trade Union Confederation, the EU-level social partner, is doing in pushing for regulation in this area. So whether that was the Platform Work Directive or AI Act, at least we see that some of the issues start to be on their agenda, such as putting the human in the loop so that the decisions can be reviewed by a human, challenged by the worker, and then there is someone to be held accountable, that is just not completely automated. Also, one interesting, so to say, strand of countering the trend is just putting limits on where AI can be used. Perhaps then it's just not directly applicable to working time reduction or working time limits, but just where it cannot cross the boundary, what kind of data it cannot collect, or what kind of data it cannot use in the process of deciding on work of workers, so as the emotions, moods, health, or some private information. So that's, I think that's this sort of information.
And Indy, thank you so much for your question. I think in answering that, it really depends a lot on the specific country in the global south, but often across the regions, what we see is that enforceability mechanisms are quite weak. So, you know, like in Kenya, for example, which has the 48-hour max, you know, they would just get around it by essentially trying to make it like volunteer, just about, it would be nice if you came in to meet your targets, and no one's going to stop them, right? Like the trade union movement is very weak there. A lot of the workers we talked to didn't know what a trade union was. They're, you know, the company itself is very antagonistic to a union forming within the company. And what they really care about is their clients and the standards that the clients say have to be set for the workers. So obviously it would depend, and I don't really have that much data from other countries necessarily. But you know, the idea that Meta or Tesla or whatever would stipulate workers cannot work more than this many hours for a shift. Like, if they do that in those situations, they will really stick to that because they don't want to lose any kind of client contracts. And so when, you know, they had all kinds of things, they always were very dodgily done, but they had like wellness counselors, they had strange like break structures for how the shift would be organized to meet certain standards that clients had set. So I think just in terms of like how much power different companies have within these supply chains, it's often the lead companies that call the shots down the line. And if there are things that the downstream AI data annotation companies can get away with that they think they, you know, the lead firms will never find out about, then they might do that. But they're very cautious and they treat the client like a god. They really they'll do anything that the client says because the contracts are extremely lucrative. The profit margins that we saw were like 30 or 40%. Like they were creaming huge surpluses off these things. So yeah, I think that's kind of, yeah. But of course it's, you know, it's always a complicated question of like, where are the pressure points that you can act on?
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? I'm gonna have a look at our chat.
In the meantime, I can just add one kind of comment or observation. It's just really telling in what conditions or the social context the AI is now being developed. So the work practices used by the humans feeding in the data categorization, right? This is all outsourced, also thanks to AI to some extent. It's outsourced to countries that are much more vulnerable to exploitation because of the less of representation. And then the practices, management practices that are being mostly coined from those are also quite exploitative if they are not countered by regulation. So it's a very innovative, it's at the forefront of technology. The high-flying professionals probably are quite successful people in terms of their working lives, but actually the whole social support of that or social consequences are quite negative and really building on vulnerabilities across the globe and across the workforce. It's just an observation. It's really just layers of the vulnerability that just make it grow and progress.
Thank you so much. I don't think we have any other questions, so I think that is a great summary actually of what we've been talking about today. Thank you to both of our speakers for excellent presentations and taking time to answer some of our questions. Thank you for the participants. So we have recorded this webinar and we will be uploading it to our website. And yeah, thank you everyone for participating today.
And thank you, Alex and India, for organizing and inviting all us here. Thanks.
Thank you.
No problem. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day. And yeah, I hope you guys have a sunny day the same way we have here.
Thank
Bye.
you, Cindy. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.